Welcome to the new video of NeuroPhilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The illusion of coldness. Amid the emotional turbulence of the modern world, people are often taught that survival requires hardening their hearts. We live in an age that values independence, control, and resilience, but somewhere along the way, these virtues have been confused with coldness. From childhood onward, many of us hear phrases like, "Don't cry or they'll think you're weak," or "Never show people how much you care, or they'll use it against you." These warnings echo through families, schools, and workplaces, gradually shaping a belief that emotions are liabilities. It is not surprising, then, that countless individuals come to see emotional detachment as the only shield against suffering. The logic seems simple enough: if vulnerability exposes us to pain, then the solution is to strip away vulnerability entirely. Better to live behind walls of distance than risk rejection, betrayal, or humiliation. Better to feel nothing at all than to feel too much. This way of thinking has become deeply rooted in our collective imagination, reinforced by popular culture. Look at the characters who are often celebrated as strong in films or novels. They are portrayed as cool, calculating, untouchable figures who rarely falter or reveal weakness. They keep their faces stoic, their emotions buried, and their connections superficial. These figures become the models for resilience, embodying the fantasy that strength means invulnerability, and invulnerability means emotional numbness. But Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, saw this belief as a dangerous illusion. Jung argued that genuine emotional strength does not come from suppressing feelings, but from integrating them. In his decades of clinical work, he witnessed the enormous costs that came with repressing emotion. What the ego tries to bury does not disappear. On the contrary, it returns in disguised and distorted forms: explosive anger, persistent anxiety, recurring nightmares, or a hollow sense of emptiness. The individual who believes they are untouchable is, paradoxically, often the most fragile of all. Why is this so? Because coldness, far from protecting the psyche, isolates it. A wall may shield us from the arrows of pain, but it also blocks the warmth of intimacy and joy. To be numb to suffering is also to be numb to connection. And connection, Jung would insist, is not just a luxury, it is a necessity of the human soul. When we cut ourselves off from others in the name of safety, we slowly starve the psyche of the nourishment it needs to thrive. The irony is profound. By trying to avoid pain, we make ourselves more vulnerable to it. The rigid defenses of the ego may protect us in the short term, especially during acute crises. After all, there are moments when we must contain emotions in order to endure: during a family emergency, the loss of a job, or the shock of betrayal. In those instances, a temporary armor can help us survive the storm. But to live permanently behind that armor is like contracting every muscle in the body and never letting go. Eventually, the tension takes its toll. Jung saw this over and over again in his patients. Individuals who appeared outwardly strong, self-controlled, disciplined, impervious, would break down under the weight of hidden suffering. They developed physical symptoms like insomnia or headaches. They struggled with panic attacks, sudden outbursts of rage, or depression that seemed to come from nowhere. These eruptions were not signs of weakness, they were the unconscious demanding to be acknowledged. Jung understood the psyche as an organic system, one that does not tolerate imbalance indefinitely. What is denied in consciousness is pushed into the unconscious, and what is buried there inevitably returns, often in disruptive and destructive ways. This is why Jung believed that coldness as a strategy for emotional survival is not only incomplete, but profoundly misleading. It promises protection but delivers fragility. It appears to shield us but ultimately exposes us. When we deny vulnerability, we also deny instinct and intuition, those subtle forms of emotional wisdom that alert us to danger, guide us through conflict, and help us navigate relationships. A person who has numbed themselves cannot read the nuances of others. They become blind to manipulation, unable to sense betrayal until it is too late. By refusing to feel, they forfeit the very tools that could truly keep them safe. And yet, despite these consequences, the myth of coldness persists. Why? Because fear runs deep. The fear of rejection, humiliation, or betrayal drives people to seek control at any cost. To open oneself to feeling seems to invite disaster, and so the ego clings to its walls, hoping that if it is rigid enough, nothing can get through. But Jung's psychology reminds us that life is not meant to be lived in extremes. To shut down emotions is not strength but avoidance. To open without boundaries is not love but recklessness. True resilience lies in finding a third path, one that acknowledges pain without being destroyed by it, one that honors vulnerability without letting it consume us. This is the paradox Jung explored throughout his work. Strength and sensitivity are not opposites, but complements. To be untouchable does not mean to be cold. It means to carry both light and shadow within oneself without collapsing under the tension. It means to face suffering without repression and joy without fear of loss. Thus, the illusion of coldness must be dispelled if we are to move toward true psychological wholeness. Walls may seem protective, but they are prisons as well. Real invulnerability, Jung would insist, comes not from closing ourselves off, but from the courageous integration of all that we are. The cost of emotional walls. When people build walls around their hearts, they believe they are protecting themselves from pain. The logic feels convincing: if the outside world can't reach me, it can't hurt me. If no one gets too close, no one can betray me. This survival strategy is so widespread that it often goes unquestioned. Yet Carl Jung saw through this defense. He argued that what we call emotional protection is often self-imposed exile, and the price of that exile is higher than we imagine. At first, the wall may feel safe. A person who has been betrayed or ridiculed learns to avoid repeating the experience. They withdraw, keeping emotions hidden, showing little of themselves. On the surface, this can look like maturity, composure, even strength. Friends or colleagues might say, "She never lets anything get to her," or "He's so strong, nothing rattles him." But beneath the surface, a different story unfolds. The wall not only keeps out pain, it also blocks love, intimacy, and trust. Jung observed this paradox everywhere. The individual who tries hardest to avoid suffering often ends up suffering the most. The loneliness created by detachment is subtle but relentless. Human beings are not built for isolation. We need bonds of empathy and closeness to feel alive. When those bonds are cut off in the name of safety, the psyche begins to wither. What started as a defense becomes a prison, and the person who once sought freedom from pain now finds themselves trapped in emptiness. The illusion of strength through coldness is reinforced by cultural stories. We are shown images of stoic warriors, silent heroes, and indifferent leaders who seem invincible precisely because they feel nothing. Popular culture glorifies these figures, turning them into ideals of strength. But Jung would argue that this strength is brittle. It breaks under real pressure because it lacks flexibility. True strength, he believed, is not about impenetrability but about resilience, the ability to bend without shattering. The cost of emotional walls becomes clear when life delivers its inevitable blows. A layoff, a divorce, the illness of a loved one, moments when emotions cannot be locked away forever. In these times, the person who has walled themselves off discovers that they are unequipped to face their own feelings. Having spent years suppressing vulnerability, they no longer know how to process grief or fear. The emotions they repressed now erupt with overwhelming intensity. Jung saw this phenomenon repeatedly in his patients. Individuals who lived behind thick walls would eventually break down. Some suffered panic attacks, others insomnia, others bursts of anger with no clear trigger. These were not random disorders, but the psyche's way of forcing recognition. The unconscious, Jung argued, cannot be silenced indefinitely. What is denied above the surface festers below, returning as symptoms, dreams, or crises. The greater the wall, the greater the eruption when it finally cracks. But there is another, more subtle danger to coldness: it blinds us. Emotions, far from being weaknesses, serve as guides. They allow us to read the nuances of others' behavior, to sense sincerity or deceit, to recognize when we are safe or in danger. When someone numbs themselves in the name of protection, they cut off this inner radar. They become less able to see manipulation, less able to detect warning signs in relationships. In trying not to feel, they make themselves more vulnerable to harm. This paradox reveals a tragic irony. The person who builds emotional walls in order to feel safe often ends up less safe. By suppressing their emotions, they lose touch with their instincts. By silencing their vulnerability, they silence their wisdom. Jung believed that instincts and emotions are not enemies but allies. They are part of the psyche's natural defense system, warning us, guiding us, protecting us in ways logic alone cannot. The long-term cost of coldness is not only psychological but existential. Life becomes narrower, flatter, less meaningful. Without the full range of emotions, joy, grief, love, fear, anger, tenderness, existence loses its depth. Bonds remain shallow, conversations superficial, experiences dulled. The wall that once promised protection leaves the individual alienated, not only from others but from themselves. For Jung, this rigidity was one of the greatest obstacles to individuation, the process of becoming one's true, whole self. Individuation requires openness to all aspects of the psyche, including the parts that are uncomfortable or painful. A person who hides behind coldness cannot embark on this journey. They remain trapped in one-sidedness, cut off from the richness of their inner life. And yet, many cling to coldness because they believe the alternative, vulnerability, means weakness. But Jung's insights invite us to see another way. He taught that we do not have to choose between fragility and hardness. There is a middle path, one that integrates vulnerability and strength rather than setting them against each other. This path does not require building walls, nor does it require leaving oneself defenseless. It asks instead for courage, the courage to face emotions, to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it, and to let suffering become a teacher rather than an enemy. Coldness may appear to work for a time. It may provide temporary relief from heartbreak or betrayal. But eventually, the cost becomes undeniable. Loneliness deepens, connections thin out, and the psyche revolts. The wall becomes too heavy to bear. That is why Jung described coldness as a dangerous myth. It does not protect, it imprisons. It does not strengthen, it weakens. It does not make us untouchable, it makes us brittle. The real challenge is to protect the heart without freezing it, to remain open without being destroyed by pain. This challenge leads us directly to one of Jung's most powerful insights, the the transcendent function. Unlike the false safety of walls, the transcendent function offers a way to hold pain and love, strength and vulnerability, side by side. It does not avoid contradiction but transforms it into something higher. And so the great question arises, if coldness is not the answer, what is? If walls cannot protect us, how can we remain safe without losing our humanity? This question sets the stage for Jung's most profound solution, a path not of avoidance, but of integration. The transcendent function. At the heart of Carl Jung's psychology lies an idea that few outside the deeper circles of his work truly understand, the transcendent function. It is a concept both subtle and powerful, one that describes how human beings can withstand contradictions without collapsing. For Jung, this was not simply a technique for emotional survival, but a pathway to transformation. Most of us are trained by life to see everything in extremes. We divide our inner world into neat categories, strong or weak, right or wrong, vulnerable or protected. When faced with conflict, the ego wants quick answers. It says, either I forgive completely or I cut this person out forever. Either I love without boundaries or I shut down entirely. The ego thrives on absolutes, because absolutes give the illusion of control. But Jung argued that life does not move in straight lines. Reality is full of opposites that resist neat resolution. Love and anger can exist at the same time. Courage can coexist with fear. A desire for intimacy may burn alongside a longing for distance. To the rational ego, these contradictions feel unbearable, and so it tries to suppress one side. Yet what we push away only grows stronger in the unconscious, returning as neuroses, obsessions, or explosive emotions. The transcendent function offers another path. Rather than repressing one pole in favor of the other, it holds both in tension, allowing something new to emerge. Jung described it as a higher synthesis, a third way born from the collision of opposites. It is not compromise, where both sides are watered down, but transformation, where opposites combine to create something that transcends them. Consider love and boundaries. The ego says, either I love and surrender completely, or I protect myself and close off. The transcendent function makes space for both. Love can flow fully, but boundaries remain firm. Another example is betrayal. The ego demands a simple solution, total forgiveness or permanent rejection. The transcendent function instead invites us to sustain the pain, neither repressing it nor letting it destroy us. Out of this endurance comes a deeper wisdom, the ability to trust again, but more wisely. Jung insisted this was not an intellectual exercise. One cannot simply think, I will hold both sides and feel better. The transcendent function arises from the psyche itself, often through symbolic processes. It may appear in dreams that reveal hidden truths. It may emerge in art, imagination, or sudden insights that feel almost otherworldly. Jung compared this to alchemy, the ancient practice of transforming base metals into gold. The alchemists, he believed, were unknowingly describing the same psychological process, the union of opposites into a higher whole. For the alchemists, the sun and moon, masculine and feminine, fire and water, were not just substances but symbols of psychic polarities. Their union was the creation of the philosopher's stone, a metaphor for ultimate transformation. Jung saw in their work a mirror of the human soul. Just as the alchemists sought to reconcile opposites in their crucibles, so too must the psyche reconcile the contradictions within itself. In practical terms, the transcendent function requires patience and courage. When confronted with inner conflict, most of us want resolution as quickly as possible. We want the pain to end, the contradiction to dissolve. But the psyche does not transform on command. Jung noted that the transcendent function often requires sustained tension, the willingness to sit with discomfort without rushing to a solution. This is profoundly difficult. It demands that we hold anger without lashing out, grief without drowning in it, desire without losing ourselves. Yet it is precisely in this space, uncomfortable, unresolved, uncertain, that the psyche begins to reorganize itself. Jung described this process as a dialogue between consciousness, the ego, and the unconscious. The ego brings awareness, clarity, and focus. The unconscious brings imagery, emotion, and depth. When these two forces interact, something entirely new can be born, a synthesis that honors both without collapsing into either. This is the transcendent function in action. One of Jung's most striking observations was that this process often manifested through dreams. Patients who wrestled with unbearable contradictions would sometimes dream of unifying symbols, a wedding of opposites, a circle containing conflicting elements, or golden figures representing harmony. These were not coincidences, but signs that the psyche itself was working toward integration. The unconscious, he believed, was an ally in healing, constantly striving to restore balance. Why is this so important for becoming untouchable without coldness? Because without the transcendent function, we remain trapped in the false choices of the ego, either too open and vulnerable or too closed and cold. The transcendent function dissolves this trap. It shows us that we can endure contradiction without breaking, that we can be both sensitive and strong, both compassionate and firm. This flexibility creates a kind of emotional resilience that walls can never provide. Imagine a tree in a storm. A rigid pole may snap under pressure, but a tree bends, sways, and survives. The transcendent function is that flexibility of the soul. It allows us to bend without breaking, to endure tension until transformation occurs. Jung emphasized that this is not easy. Few people are willing to tolerate the discomfort of inner contradiction long enough for the transcendent function to work. Many rush to simple answers, to repression or denial. But those who can hold the tension are rewarded with profound growth. They discover that suffering, when endured consciously, becomes a source of meaning. Pain is not erased, but it is transmuted into wisdom. The great mistake, Jung wrote, is to think that strength lies in choosing one extreme. True strength lies in standing between extremes, in allowing them to coexist until they give birth to something new. This is the alchemy of the soul. This is the transcendent function. And so the path to emotional invulnerability without coldness begins here, not in shutting down, not in hardening, but in opening ourselves to the paradox of being human. To love and fear, to hurt and to heal, to embrace contradictions without collapsing beneath them. For Jung, this was the secret to becoming untouchable, resilient, whole, and yet profoundly human. Holding the tension. Few challenges are as demanding for the human psyche as enduring the clash of opposing emotions. When we are betrayed, criticized, or rejected, everything in us longs for immediate relief. The ego wants to escape the discomfort at once. It urges us to choose sides, lash out in anger or retreat into silence, forgive instantly or cut ties completely. Yet Carl Jung taught that real transformation requires something radically different, the art of holding the tension. Holding the tension means resisting the urge for premature resolution. It means allowing contradictory emotions to coexist without forcing one to dominate. Anger and love, closeness and distance, pain and compassion, all can exist side by side. Instead of collapsing into despair or repression, the psyche is invited to carry the burden of ambivalence. This, Jung believed, is the essential condition for the transcendent function to occur. Without it, there can be no growth, only cycles of repression and eruption. The difficulty lies in the discomfort. Most people find ambivalence intolerable. We want certainty, clarity, clean lines. But the psyche does not move according to the ego's timetable. It needs time to reorganize itself, to process contradictions, to allow new insights to emerge. Jung compared this process to the alchemical furnace. Metals are placed under steady heat until they transform. Similarly, when opposing emotions are held in awareness, the friction generates inner fire, uncomfortable at first, but ultimately transformative. Imagine someone betrayed by a close friend. The ego wants a clear choice: either forgive completely and pretend nothing happened, or sever the relationship forever. Holding the tension means acknowledging the hurt while also recognizing the love that remains. It means allowing grief and affection to coexist, however uncomfortable. Over time, this tension can lead to a deeper understanding of boundaries, loyalty, and self-respect. The betrayal does not vanish, but it becomes part of a larger story of growth rather than a wound that defines one's life. Another example is harsh criticism. When attacked, the ego may want to retaliate with equal harshness or sink into shame and self-doubt. Holding the tension allows for a different response. It asks, is there truth in this criticism? Or does it reflect more about the critic than about me? By refusing to collapse into rage or despair, one can extract valuable insight without losing self-worth. This middle path preserves dignity while leaving room for growth. Holding the tension does not mean wallowing in pain. It is not about cultivating suffering as a virtue. Rather, it is about remaining conscious of pain without being consumed by it. It is the discipline of saying, yes, I feel anger and sadness, but I will not let either blind me. It is the courage to look at one's own inner conflict and resist the temptation of easy answers. In this space, transformation slowly begins. But why is this practice so rare? Because it requires endurance. The ego craves quick relief, while the unconscious moves at a slower, deeper rhythm. Jung noted that most people flee from contradiction into rigidity, choosing coldness, denial, or impulsive reaction. Few are willing to sustain the heat of unresolved emotions long enough for something new to emerge. Yet those who do discover an extraordinary gift, psychological gold. This gold is not the absence of pain but the integration of pain into meaning. Every wound consciously endured enlarges the psyche, making it more whole. Jung often repeated that the goal of life is not perfection but completeness. Perfection seeks to erase flaws, to avoid contradictions. Completeness accepts them, integrates them, and transforms them into sources of wisdom. Holding the tension is the crucible in which this transformation occurs. The consequences of avoiding this process are clear. When contradictions are repressed rather than held, they fester in the unconscious. Anxiety, depression, explosive anger, or psychosomatic illness often result. The psyche rebels against denial. But when contradictions are faced and carried, the psyche reorganizes itself, giving birth to new insights, new strength, and a deeper serenity. This practice also has profound implications for relationships. In love, friendships, or family, conflicts are inevitable. The ego often demands quick fixes, either deny the problem or end the relationship. But holding the tension means allowing conflict to exist without rushing to closure. It means listening to discomfort, recognizing complexity, and giving space for new understanding. Relationships that survive this process often emerge stronger, more honest, and more resilient. Of course, holding the tension is not easy. It demands self-awareness, patience, and courage. It often feels like walking through fire without knowing what lies on the other side. Yet Jung believed that this fire is sacred. It is the furnace of transformation, the alchemical process through which suffering becomes wisdom. Think of it like a seed planted in the soil. From the outside, nothing seems to happen for weeks. The ego grows restless, demanding results. But underground, something is stirring. The seed cracks, roots spread, and life prepares to break the surface. Holding the tension is the willingness to wait in that dark, uncertain space until new growth emerges. This is why Jung saw holding the tension as one of the highest forms of psychological discipline. It requires faith that the psyche knows how to heal itself if given the chance. It requires humility to admit that the ego does not have all the answers. And it requires courage to endure discomfort long enough for transformation to occur. Ultimately, the art of holding the tension teaches us a radical truth: suffering itself can be a teacher. Pain is not meaningless chaos but a catalyst for growth. The contradictions we fear are the very conditions that make transformation possible. To avoid them is to remain small, rigid, and brittle. To hold them is to become whole. In the end, holding the tension is not about choosing between vulnerability and strength. It is about becoming strong because we are vulnerable. It is about discovering that true resilience does not come from hardening against life, but from embracing life in all its contradictions. And so the great question arises: if we can endure the tension long enough, what emerges? How does the psyche transform suffering into wisdom, chaos into order, pain into meaning? The answer lies in Jung's vision of alchemical synthesis, the inner process by which wounds are transmuted into psychological gold. Alchemical gold, becoming untouchable without coldness. Carl Jung often turned to alchemy when searching for metaphors to explain the workings of the human psyche. To most people, alchemy evokes images of medieval laboratories where men in robes tried to turn base metals into gold. But Jung saw something deeper. For him, alchemy was not a primitive chemistry, it was a symbolic language for transformation. The alchemists were describing in metaphor what the human soul has always done: take suffering, chaos, and contradiction, and refine them into wisdom, resilience, and meaning. This is what Jung called alchemical synthesis. When a person endures suffering consciously, when they hold the tension without fleeing into repression or coldness, the psyche begins to transform. Pain becomes not an enemy to escape, but a raw material to be refined. The lead of betrayal, grief, or rejection is slowly transmuted into the gold of inner strength and insight. This transformation does not happen instantly. Just as the alchemist's furnace required steady heat and patience, so too does the psyche require time and discipline. The ego longs for quick relief, but the deeper self insists on process. This is why Jung urged people not to deny their wounds but to integrate them. Denial leaves the lead untouched, corroding the psyche from within. Integration, though difficult, makes possible the birth of something entirely new. A classic example is betrayal. In the moment of discovery, the ego sees only destruction: trust shattered, intimacy broken, anger burning. Many respond by hardening themselves, vowing never to trust again. But if the pain is held and integrated, something else can emerge. The betrayed person may come to understand their own boundaries more clearly, to value their self-respect more deeply, and to choose relationships with greater wisdom in the future. The betrayal remains part of their story, but it no longer defines them. Instead, it becomes the soil from which new strength grows. This is psychological gold. It does not erase pain, but it changes its meaning. The wound becomes not a mark of weakness, but a source of depth. Those who pass through this alchemical process often carry themselves differently. Their presence radiates calm and authenticity. They are not untouchable because they are cold, but because they have faced pain and discovered it cannot destroy them. They no longer need walls, because they are rooted too deeply to be toppled by passing storms. Jung referred to this state as transparent shielding. Unlike the rigid defenses of the ego, transparent shielding does not cut a person off from the world. Instead, it allows them to remain open and empathetic while still protected. Criticism may sting, but it no longer destabilizes. Rejection may hurt, but it does not shatter. Manipulation is harder to achieve, because intuition and self-knowledge stand guard. The person has become resilient not by avoiding life, but by engaging it fully and transforming its challenges into wisdom. This state is not theoretical. Jung observed it in countless patients who, after enduring deep crises, emerged with an unexpected serenity. They had not avoided pain, nor had they armored themselves against it. Instead, they had allowed pain to reshape them. Their very wounds had become sources of strength. The imagery of alchemy captures this beautifully. The alchemists spoke of solutio et coagulatio, dissolve and coagulate. First, the old structures dissolve under pressure, leaving chaos. Then, slowly, a new form takes shape, stronger and purer than before. In psychological terms, this means breaking down old defenses, old illusions, and allowing something new to emerge. To dissolve is to admit pain, contradiction, and vulnerability. To coagulate is to integrate these experiences into a new wholeness. Jung often noted that this process produced symbolic images in dreams, the mystical marriage, the sun and moon united, radiant figures of gold. These were not just poetic fantasies. They were signs that the psyche was reorganizing itself, reconciling opposites, and achieving a new balance. The individual might not understand the symbolism consciously, but their inner world was working toward integration. The beauty of alchemical synthesis is that it allows a person to remain fully human. Coldness demands that we amputate parts of ourselves, empathy, tenderness, trust, in order to avoid hurt. But alchemical synthesis invites us to keep our humanity intact while still becoming resilient. It is not about shutting down feelings, but about refining them until they serve us instead of overwhelming us. In practical life, this means we can face challenges differently. A harsh workplace no longer forces us into bitterness, it can sharpen our sense of purpose. A failed relationship does not doom us to cynicism, it can awaken self-love and clarity about what we deserve. Even grief, as crushing as it feels, can deepen compassion for others who suffer. Each experience, painful though it may be, becomes material for the inner alchemy that creates wholeness. This is the essence of becoming emotionally untouchable without coldness. To be untouchable is not to be immune from pain, but to be transformed by it in such a way that pain no longer has the power to define or destroy. The arrows of life may strike, but they cannot pierce the deep roots of a psyche that has integrated its shadows. Jung believed that this was the ultimate aim of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming one's true self. Individuation is not about perfection or purity, but about completeness. It is the courage to embrace contradictions, to suffer consciously, and to allow the psyche to transform lead into gold. Those who walk this path discover that they do not need to hide behind walls or masks. Their strength lies in authenticity, in the transparent shield of a self that has made peace with its own depths. And so the illusion of coldness falls away. True invulnerability is not found in distance or numbness. It is found in wholeness, in the alchemical ability to let wounds become wisdom. This is the gold hidden within every human life, the promise that suffering can be transformed into meaning, that pain can become a teacher, and that we can stand in the world strong, sensitive, and profoundly human.